Hi, everybody. Good evening. Hope you all can hear me. I guess you can by the fact that you made motions with your hands. How's everybody doing? Rabbi Foster's here. How are you? Good. Nice to see you, at least virtually. Today, like in general, I'm sort of happy that we're in a point in the world where many things are back to in person, but today's a good day to not be driving around going places. So Zoom is useful, and the fact that we have all this tech, it's good to use it. So as I've been doing, I'm going to in the chat box, just put the handout. Again, sometimes people want to have it to print out or to look at it on another screen. But I'm going to share my screen in a second for the texts. And so what I thought that we'd do tonight is sort of move from some of the New Testament texts we were looking at back into the world of the rabbis to sort of think about rabbinic Jewish messianism, first with some texts about Bar Kokhba, who's sort of the next big messianic figure in Jewish history after Jesus of Nazareth, at least from our perspective. And then look at some Talmudic musings about the Messiah. And finally, we'll end with a look at the Rambam, because the Rambam, as he does with most things, codifies some of these ideas in easy to understand ways. And because the Rambam is so influential, it's sort of worth thinking about it, because so much of what he says ends up deeply influencing really the rest of Jewish history. One thing you'll note about my sort of chronology here, and I think this will not be intuitively obvious, is that in many ways the texts that we will be looking at tonight, not in many ways, with the exception of the biblical verses cited in the texts we will see tonight, all of these texts are later than the New Testament texts we have seen. Remember, the Mishnah comes into being only around the year 200, 220. And the Talmuds, even though obviously they collect material which is much older, the Talmuds as documents, as collections, date from far later. The Yerushalmi from some time in the end of the 4th, maybe the beginning of the 5th century, and the Babylonian Talmud much later still. So in as much as we are accustomed to thinking of Judaism as older than Christianity, right? And in some ways that's obviously true because of the biblical texts and Second Temple Judaism and all the ways in which we as rabbinic Jews carry on biblical law and things like that. However, if we really think of ourselves as rabbinic Jews, right? Rabbinic Judaism is younger than Christianity. And in many ways, rabbinic Judaism responds to Christian ideas. And therefore, I think we have to understand that some of our own Jewish messianisms really, to some degree, are responses to Christian ideas. And this is very important to keep in mind, as I'm always at pains to try to teach my students, most of whom are, right, they don't think bad things about Jews. They're not anti-Semitic, at least certainly not consciously, and yet they tend to see Christianity as Judaism 2.0, right, as the software update of Judaism. That once upon a time there was a Judaism and then came Christianity, and that the Jews stayed the same, and that modern Jews are sort of living fossils, like ginkgo trees or something, that despite the fact that the rest of the world has changed, this strange species is sort of caught back in the past. Sheila, give me just 1 second to finish the introduction. And there's a kind of soft supersessionism in that notion, because it imagines that Judaism doesn't evolve or change or adapt or respond to changing conditions. And the biggest thing that rabbinic Judaism has to respond to is the loss of the temple. And think about all of us here in suburban Cleveland, where we're able to live really full Jewish lives in our strange portable religion, right? None of which would be possible without the rabbis' innovation to try to deal with the loss of the temple. Yeah, Sheila, go ahead.
Isn't it good though that they think that Judaism came before Christianity, in the sense that well,
Well, isn't it good? I don't know. I guess part of my job as a scholar is to tell them what's true, not necessarily what's good.
okay.
And therefore, I'm not worried so much if it's good. I mean, obviously, I think part of my job is explicitly to fight anti-Semitism, to engage these students with Jewish ideas, and to sort of discover the beauty and power of our tradition, such that when they go out into the world and encounter Jews and Jewish ideas, they'll say, "Oh, yeah, I know about the Talmud. I studied the Mishnah with that weird Professor Bickart back in college, and I know a little bit about that. Oh, yeah, it's about law, and it's about not so much about faith, but about acting and all these kinds of things." But I really think that we have to understand that Rabbinic Judaism is in many ways newer than the beginnings of Christianity. I'll give you just one example of this before we sort of delve into text. I don't know if any of you have ever had this experience, but I have had evangelical Protestants say, "Rabbi, I'd love to come to your Seder because I want to experience what the Lord did," right? Forget about the fact that I don't think he's the Lord, whatever. Okay, right? And what I say is, you're welcome to come to the Seder, but Jesus didn't go to a Seder. The Seder is a rabbinic invention, right? Passover in the time of the temple, as the Gospels state very clearly, is a meal centered on eating the Korban Pesach, the Paschal lamb, right? This rabbinic invention, can you imagine how bereft Jews must have felt in the wake of the destruction of the temple with no Paschal lamb to eat on Passover? What do we do, right? And the rabbis have this ingenious solution, which is to say, no problem, right? You got no problems. That we're going to radically change the meal from a meal that's centered on the eating of this particular sacrifice to a meal about questions and answers and midrash about the Exodus. Well, it's really different. Of course it is. It's connected, right? The Paschal lamb is deeply connected to the story of the Exodus and the salvation from Egypt and all of these ideas. But the rabbis, by sort of moving it away from only the eating and the performance of a sacrifice to this deeply intellectual engagement with interpreting biblical text, that's new and different, and nobody did that in that way in the first century or even in the second century. And therefore, to say that sort of Judaism is this unchanging thing and that as if Jesus went to a Seder is to sort of deny the vitality of Rabbinic Judaism and the deep creative power of the whole Rabbinic idea. And so if that leads them to think that Rabbinic Judaism is newer or equal, that I'm proposing the model not as mother-daughter, but as siblings, which of course is the rabbinic model of this interaction between Jews and Christians as well, in this model of Jacob and Esau, where Jacob is Israel, is us, and Esau is Rome, is the church, right? We're siblings. And, like my kids fight, right? And pull each other's hair and beat each other up and that kind of stuff. Well, maybe that's a more accurate model. And frankly, as somebody who's not only interested in teaching Christians about Jews, but also sort of, working together to solve deep problems in our shared world, I think the model of Jews and Christians as siblings can be really, really powerful. Okay, so with that, I'm going to share my screen. If I can find the, yes. And hopefully you can all see this. So I just want to start very briefly with a text from the Yerushalmi and a text of the Bavli about Bar Kokhba. And just a sort of very brief historical introduction. In addition to the Great Revolt of 70 to 73 AD, which results in the Romans destroying the temple and razing Jerusalem, Clearly, Judean culture does not despair of a military solution. And only about 60 years later, in the 130s, around the year 130, there's yet another revolt against Rome. We now, I mean, this is among the most amazing archaeological finds in history, that we have found the letters of this man Bar Kokhba, and his letters are fascinating. He leads this revolt. We don't know all that much about him other than his name and some of what comes out in his letters. But he seems to have an amazing first campaign against the Romans and runs the Romans out of town, so much so that he begins minting coins, right? And this is one of the things you do in the ancient world when you take over a place, is to start minting your own coins. These coins are fascinating because they don't have human figures on them, right, indicating something about Bar Kokhba's religious stance, a sort of very traditional Jewish antipathy towards the graven image. And he stamps them. This is year one of the redeemed Jerusalem, of rebuilt Jerusalem. So whether or not they began to rebuild the temple, we don't know. We don't know. But it seems even if they hadn't yet started to rebuild the temple, that was clearly the point. And the Romans actually have to sail an entire legion of soldiers all the way from England to put down the Bar Kokhba revolt, which they do, and with terrible consequences. Okay, so we have this. We'll start just with a verse from Sefer Bamidbar, and this is the very end of Bilam's prophecy in Parshat Balak. Right, when Balak is kind of fed up with this foreign prophet who seems to be blessing the Israelites instead of cursing them as he wants, and at the very end, once Balak has sort of left and gone away, Bilam gives this sort of prophecy about the future. Okay? And he says, "Erenu velo ata," I see, but not now. Ashurenu velo karov. Right, I can understand it, but it's not soon. This is classic biblical parallelism, sort of where the same thing is said in two slightly different ways. Darach kochav miYaakov, a star shall come out of Jacob. Vikam shevet miYisrael. You see that parallelism. And a scepter, the scepter is the mark of kingship, shall arise from Israel. Umachatz pa'atei Moav, it shall, smush the borderlands of Moab, the karkar kol b'nei Shet, and destroy all of the area of Shet. And so obviously, as I have bolded here, this is the crucial verse. Darach kochav miYaakov. What does it mean? A star will come out of Jacob. Okay? So here in the Yerushalmi, in the Palestinian Talmud, Tani Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the famous Shimon Bar Yochai, okay, right? We maybe most famous as the purported author of the Zohar, but he's also really Rabbi Akiva's star student. Pardon the pun with the star here. And he says as follows: Akiva Rabbi, Akiva, my teacher, Rabbi Akiva, Hayad Doresh, would apply the following midrash to this verse: Darach kochav miYaakov. Right, a star shall come forth from Jacob, but he read it as Darach Kozba miYaakov. Okay, and Kozba or Koziba seems to be Bar Kokhba's actual name. He was the son of Koziba. Okay, and it was Rabbi Akiva, according to this text, who makes this pun. Right, what is this verse talking about? A star shall come forth from Yaakov. It means this guy, Bar Kokhba, Bar Koziba, will come forth from Jacob, and therefore will be a Shevet in Israel. He'll be a king for Israel. Okay? And now we have the editor of the Yerushalmi popping in, Rabbi Akiva, Kidahava Chame Bar Koziba, whenever he would see Bar Kokhba go by, Haya Omer, Dain hu Malka Mashiach. This is the King Messiah. Okay? So you get no better sort of proof from that. And Rebbe Akiva's, not chopped liver, right? He's really the star in many ways of Rabbinic Judaism, the hero of the Talmud. And Rabbi Akiva seems therefore to have thought, presumably in this period where Bar Kokhba is winning the revolt against Rome, well, if we're winning the revolt against Rome, I guess here we are in the Messianic age. And yet, okay, there's as always, or almost always in rabbinic texts, there's a competing voice, right? There's a machloket, there's a dispute about this. Amarle, Rabbi Yochanan ben Torta would say to him, Akiva, Ya'alu asavim belechayich va'adayin ben David lo yavo. Grass will grow through your cheekbones, and the son of David will still not have arrived, right? You're going to be dead and rotten, and the Messiah will not have come. So now, is this a local dispute? Is it really just that Rabbi Yochanan ben Torta thinks that this isn't the Messiah, it's not happening? Or is there sort of a more global dispute here about don't announce messianism, right? Messianism is problematic. It can only go bad for us if we start proclaiming people the Messiah. The Messiah is something that we can't expect to happen in our lifetimes. The Messiah is something that we have to think about in the way, 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 way far distant future. Okay. And I think it's that latter approach, which we will see at the end of the evening tonight in the Rambam, really takes up that approach. Okay. Now, I have no idea how historically accurate this is, right? This seems to be the only place in all of rabbinic literature where we have this linking of Rabbi Akiva and Bar Kokhba. It certainly is not, right? We have this report, even though we have the drasha, the midrash, the interpretation in Rabbi Akiva's mouth, the narrative is in the mouth of the author of the Yerushalmi, who certainly lives long after Rabbi Akiva. A well-known scholar, Peter Schaefer, has argued very strongly that we should not read this as a historical fact that Rabbi Akiva did this, that, or the other thing. But it certainly seems that later rabbinic ideas are sort of placing this in the mouth of Rabbi Akiva, and this dispute sort of is the Messiah something that could happen in our day, or is it not? And I think those are sort of the two poles. Well, the Babylonian Talmud also goes there and says as follows. There's this very, very interesting long section in the 90s in Sanhedrin, which is in Perek Chelek, usually in printed text, the very last chapter of Sanhedrin, which is all about who does and does not merit a portion in the world to come. It's almost all Agadah, it's almost all narrative and homiletics, and so there's this long section that sort of dwells on messianism, and this is part of it. Okay? Bar Koziba malach tartin ushnin upalga. Tartin shnin upalga. Bar Koziba ruled, that is to say, he defeated the Romans and was running Judea for 2.5 years. Amar laho Rabbanan, and he said to the rabbis, Ana Mashiach, I am the Messiah. Huh? So it's a little bit different in the Babylonian Talmud's version. Instead of having a rabbi, announcing that Bar Kokhba is the Messiah, he's the one who comes to the rabbis and says, I'm it. I'm the Messiah. Okay, Amrule, but here in the Bavli, the rabbis are not so interested. Right? Amrule b'mashicha kativ demorach v'da'in. This is very, very strange. Exactly where it's written, this seems to be an analysis of a very obscure verse in Isaiah that I don't want to get into, right? But it is that somehow the Messiah will be able literally to sniff out guilt and innocence, right? That unlike judges who have to rely on evidence and testimony and facts, the Messiah will be able to sniff you and decide whether you are guilty or innocent. Okay, so they have this sort of test that they can apply. And so they say, let's check it out. Let's see if he can tell whether people are guilty by smelling them. When they saw that he was unable to do this trick, they killed him. Okay. Now, who the they is, I don't know. Does this mean that according to the Babylonian Talmud, the rabbis themselves executed Bar Kokhba? Or does it mean that somehow the Romans were able, when the Romans saw that he had no power, they came and killed him? Certainly, I wouldn't argue that this has any historical evidence about Bar Kokhba, but you can tell that the Babylonian rabbis seem to be, or they're at least depicting their ancestors as being much less interested in a Messiah, right? They're deeply skeptical and seem not to be so upset when it doesn't work out. Okay. And I think, scholars go back and forth on this a great deal, but certainly among, Jacob Neusner wrote probably more books about the rabbinic canon than the rabbinic canon contains. Okay, but one of his best books, do I have it here? I don't remember. Is called Judaism, the Evidence of the Mishnah. And in that book, he really argues that the Mishnah seems to understand that the temple is not coming back anytime soon. That in the wake of the Bar Kokhba revolt and the utter destruction of Jerusalem, it's at this point that Jews are forbidden from even entering the city. And the rabbinic movement really moves towards the Galilee at that point, that it's really in the wake of Bar Kokhba and the sages of that generation, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yehoshua, these are the major sages of the Mishnah, that they have really decided, okay, we're not going to rebuild the temple and we need a new path forward. And so it's possible in many ways that this second failed Messiah, right, really is a kind of impetus for the creation of the Mishnah and the development of a kind of Judaism that will be able to survive even though we no longer have the temple. Okay, questions before we move on to some other rabbinic texts? Just
Rabbi.
Yes, please go ahead.
It seems like this may be similar in a sense to the modern experience of somebody finds a cow that's completely red or brown or whatever that color is supposed to be.
Yes.
And somebody else says, no, there are 2 white hairs, there are 3 white hairs, not yet. Is this in fact perhaps similar in that if you actually found one, then you really have to almost change back to what was, and maybe that's a little scary?
Yes, I mean, I think this is a big, think about to some degree, and I think I mentioned this last week, but I think that one could see part of the debate about what's going on politically in contemporary Israeli society sort of about that question. There certainly are groups that are, right, the Temple Institute that is trying to build the vessels of the temple and wants to be completely ready in case the Messiah should show up tomorrow and we got to start sacrificing and let's go. I admit to really not being on that side. I'm deeply skeptical of the end of the world being clear. I'm much more in love with the Babylonian Talmud's approach of sort of hold your horses. Right. It's true that as a rabbinic Jew, I pray in the Amidah 3 times a day for the resumption of animal sacrifice. Like many things in Judaism, I sort of interpret that metaphorically. But I think this is a sort of a big, I don't know how active it is in terms of numbers, but I think your example is a very, very good one. Right, that there are some forces who are really pushing, the end is near, and there are other voices that say not so fast, not so fast. And I think what we see is that tension really goes all the way back to these Talmudic sources. Okay. So also in the Midrash, okay, Rabbi Tanchum Bar Chia said, and other people said that it was in the name of the Rabbanan, Le'olam ein malach hamashiach ba ad sheyivra'u kol hanishamot she'alu b'machshava lehibarot. The Messiah will not come until all of the souls, all of the human beings who would ever be created will have actually been created. Okay, and I think this is again is a sort of way of a rabbinic way of pushing messianism as far off into the future as possible. Until there are no more people being born, until all of the people are used up, the Messiah won't come. Okay, and they have a proof text for this, right? The souls which I have made. Okay, so this is a quote from Isaiah, right? I will continually accuse, nor will I always be angry, for then the spirits would go faint from me, even the souls that I have made. Okay? So, interpreting that verse in Isaiah, for the sake of the souls which I have made, and then arguing, this is very interesting, on these souls are those referred to in the book of Adam, as it is written, Zeh Sefer Toldot HaAdam. This is the book of the generations of Adam, right? In Genesis 4 or 5 or wherever it is. So it seems like this idea is that you have to wait for the entire, right? That messianism is not a normal process. Right? You'd have to wait until the normal mode of human beings coming into the world would end, and only then at the very, very end of time could it happen. Yeah, Sheila. Just unmute yourself first.
This is a sort of a wild idea, but it's crazy enough that there are people who would think it. Okay, so we have all the souls. We could say then the Messiah is not going to come quite yet, but the Messiah could take the form of another planet and aliens. I mean, if you want to make a movie, I mean, I think that's what they've done.
Absolutely.
But in other words, we will have used up everybody here.
Yeah, well.
So therefore the Messiah will come and bring forth someone elsewhere. And today, of course, we think of other other planets. We don't think of other nations anymore.
Good. And I, I mean,
that's a book for you.
Talmud is weird enough. I don't think there's any reason why it can't also include sci-fi ideas, right? And the notion of redeeming the world through whatever, right? Yeah, sure. Why not? Why not? Okay, and so just have the quote, Genesis 5. Okay. Here we have oh yeah, Ron, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, what was it, last week, in the Parsha of the week, we see that God didn't wait for the whole 400 years to go by that he thought. So maybe we have proof that we don't have to use up all the souls.
Okay. Yafa. Right. And I get, I mean, here we see this tension. And even if we were to take a sort of more postmodern approach, that maybe the Messiah isn't a person, right, but it's a state of mind, or it's an epoch in history that we could work to bring about, right? I mean, I think there are those who really think, no, we want to, and I think, Hasidism in many ways, this is not really a course on Hasidism, but Hasidism in many ways arises in the wake of the failed messiahs of Shabtai Tzvi and Frank, right? And the notion that maybe we could do something to bring the Messianic age. And in many ways, the Litvish response to that is not so fast. So, I mean, we're hearing this in the class as well, that there's this tension of, no, we could really do it. It could happen. We could be on the precipice. And other voices that say, no, not so fast. Hold your horses. I agree. I think both of these strains are present, and this tension between them runs throughout. Okay, here's a great example of well, I don't know. We'll see what you think about this. Okay, wonderful story. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi met Eliyahu Hanavi, right? The classic rabbinic story, Elijah story, right? Eliyahu's around, is wandering around occasionally, especially if you're a great Torah scholar, you get to hang out with Elijah and ask him good questions. Okay, and here they are at the tomb of Shimon Bar Yochai near Tzfat. Right, and the same Bar Yochai whom we heard about before, and he asked him, "Have I a portion in the world to come? Am I going to heaven?" He replied, "If this master desires it." And now, exactly who this Adon is it me, Elijah? Is it you, Yehoshua ben Levi? Is it Bar Yochai who's dead in the cave? Okay. And Bar Yochai said, "I saw too. meaning you and I are talking, me and you, Elijah's talking, but I heard the voice of a third, right? So apparently Bar Yochai, even though he's dead, is approachable. This is another sort of theme in rabbinic stories, that if you're a great Torah sage, you can sort of go and talk to dead people. So Yoshua ben Levi sort of, as he's now sees that he has access to Shimon Bar Yochai even in death, goes into his tomb and asks him, when will the Messiah come? Right? Got one question to ask Bar Yochai. Well, when will the Messiah come? So he said to him, go and ask him yourself. It's a weird response. To which he says, where is he? Where is he sitting? How will I find the Messiah? Answer, at the gates of Rome. Which is fascinating, right? Of all places for the Messiah to be hanging out, not in destroyed Jerusalem, not in Eretz Yisrael, but in the middle of Times Square, right? From our perspective, in the center of the world. And by what sign may I recognize him? How am I going to know that he's the Messiah? He's sitting among the poor lepers. All of them untie all at once and rebandage them together. It makes sense if I'm treating lots of people who have a bad skin disease, that when I have to change the bandages, they should all come forward and we'll take all the bandages off at once and then rebandage them all. That would be the most efficient way to treat people. However, you'll know the doctor is the Messiah because he unties and rebandages each separately. And I think the notion is that the Messiah never knows exactly the moment that the Messianic redemption will come, and so that he can't be bothered. What would happen if God calls him to be the Messiah when all the bandages are off? He'd have to take extra time to rebandage all the people, and that would cause the Messiah to tarry, and that would be bad, and so he does it in this particular way, right? This is sort of absurd, right? I must not be delayed. So he went to him. The other great feature of these fantastical rabbinic stories is that, time, space, no big deal, right? Boom, next scene, and he's in Rome and has found the Messiah. So we went to him and greeted him, saying to him, Shalom Alecha, Rabbi Umori, which is the classic rabbinic way that you address your teacher. Right? Amar le Shalom Alecha, Bar Levae, peace be upon you, O son of Levi. He says to him, when are you going to come? He says, today. I'm coming today. He went back to Elijah, and Elijah asked him, what did he say to you? Right? Good. That's exactly. No. What did he say? So he just tells Elijah the story. The Messiah said to me, Shalom Alecha, Bar Levi, peace be upon you, son of Levi. Elijah then says back, aha, he thereby assured you and your father of a portion in the world to come. Okay, by calling you Shalom Alecha, he says, peace be upon you, and calls you by your patronymic, and that means both you and your father have a share in the world to come. So even though it seems like Yehoshua ben Levi has sort of changed his question, he gets the answer to his original question. But then he has a following problem. He says, Shakore kashakarbi. He lied to me, the Messiah did. Right? He said he would come today, and where is he? He's not here. The Messiah's a liar. So Elijah has to interpret it for him. He says, Hachi amar lacha. It's classic. I mean, it's almost, this is the same formula that when the rabbis of the Talmud want to sort of read a Mishnah against what it seems to say, they use this, you don't understand. This is what it really means. What he really means is, Hayom im bekolo tishma'u. Today, if you listen to God's voice. Okay? In other words, the Messiah is always about to come, right? Is always on the precipice of coming, right? And it's up to human beings, it's up to Jews, if they're going to listen to the commandments and perform the commandments, and that'll be what brings the Messiah. The Messiah is always in the state of almost coming. Okay, I'll skip the rest of this just for the sake of time. Okay, and we have a great deal now of speculation here in the Talmud about what's it going to take for the Messiah to come. Rabbi Nahorai said, in the generation when the Messiah comes, young people will insult old people, old men will stand before the young, right? With total inversion of the normal. Daughters will rise up against their mothers, and daughters-in-law against their mothers-in-law, right? You can tell that the rabbis have a sense of humor. And even in those days, clearly the relationship of daughter-in-law and mother-in-law is a fraught one. And clearly the traditional approach is that the younger people, daughter-in-laws included, are supposed to give honor to their mothers and their mothers-in-law. And when they revolt, that's how you'll know the Messiah. The people will be dog-faced. Pnei Hador kipnei kelev. What this means, I have no idea. Okay. Ve'ein haben mitbayesh me'aviv. And sons will not be embarrassed by their parents. In other words, the Messiah won't come until the world is totally turned upside down. Now, is this a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Right? It's an interesting question. Okay. Rabbi Nehemiah taught, in the generation of the Messiah's coming, impudence will increase, value will be devalued, the vine will yield its fruit, yet wine shall be super expensive. And here is very, very interesting. The kingdom, right, the Malchut, the Roman Empire, will be converted to minut. Okay. Now, minut, usually translated as heresy, okay? By the time of the Talmud, the heresy that they're thinking about, that the empire will convert to, is probably Christianity, okay? Which is rather ironic, given that we know exactly when the empire converted to Christianity, and yet, right, Messiah is not here yet, right? With Constantine converts the empire in the middle of the 4th century, well, that was, almost 1800 years ago already. This supports Rabbi Isaac, who said the son of David will not come until the whole world is converted to the belief of heretics. Okay, what verse proves this? Hafach lavan tahorhu, with that the pasuk from Parshat Tazria, that when the strained skin lesion that appears in that leprous disease, whatever it is, tzaraat, if it's all white, then somehow it's clean, right? If it's only partially white, then it's unclean, and then we gotta put the person in quarantine, etc. But if it's all white, then it's tahor. Somehow, if the entire universe, right, converts to heresy, somehow that will be a purification of the world. Very interesting. Okay, we'll return to this idea in the Rambam, but is the empire, from a Jewish perspective, is the Roman Empire converting to Christianity a good thing or a bad thing, right? I'm not sure that it's so clear. Clearly, we, with the hindsight, how much we know about the medieval world, it's probably a bad thing. Although, who knows, right? From the rabbi's perspective, Christians and Christianity are, monotheists who know about the Torah and have all kinds of ideas which come from the Hebrew Bible. So is that a bad thing or is that a good thing? It's an interesting notion that maybe this spread of Christian ideas might have been in the rabbinic imagination. Wow, maybe this is what will bring on the messianic redemption. Okay, Tanu Rabbanan, more sort of speculation about the rabbis. Here a quote from the end of Deuteronomy: "For the Lord shall judge his people and repent himself of his servants when he sees that their power is gone and there is none shut up or left." Okay, the son of David will not come until denunciators are in abundance. All right, again, this topsy-turvy world. Another interpretation
that could allude to Jesus.
Okay, good. Yeah, maybe.
Well, there was a denunciators.
Yeah. Okay. Until the last pruta is gone from the purse. Okay, when there's no money left, when we're totally out of funds. Okay. Yet another interpretation: until the redemption is despaired of. Isn't that interesting? When the Jews no longer hope for the Messiah, that's when the Messiah will come. Really interesting. Okay, even as Rabbi Zera, who whenever he chanced upon scholars engaged, right, mitaskebe, when they're trying to calculate when the Messiah would come, Rabbi Zera would say the following, right? Shlosha ba'in behesach hadat. 3 things show up when you've forgot thinking about them. And I love these statements because you can hear the sort of twinkle, right? The sort of joke, the playfulness. And there are 3 things that show up when you least expect it. The Messiah, right? A lost object, right? It's only when you stop looking for it that you find it, and a scorpion. Okay, so the second 2 are very much this world, right? But the notion that Rabbi Zera is saying, and I think here's again one of those voices which is saying, no, stop, right? Is the more you think about the Messiah's coming, the longer it's going to take. And so that ironically, the only way to bring the Messiah is no more messianism. Okay? I think that's a very strong claim for that position that says, this is happening way far off in the future, and the more we expect it, the less it's going to come. Okay, so historically, obviously, Maimonides lives long after these texts. Maimonides is the heir not only to the Talmudic tradition, but obviously to the whole world of Greek wisdom, and especially Aristotelian philosophy, is the arch rationalist, and some of these speculative ideas about the Messiah and when the Messiah will come are foreign to the Rambam, so I don't necessarily want to privilege him. But I think what he says about the Messiah and Messianism is fascinating. Also, the fact that he collects these in Hilchot Melachim, in the laws of kings. Okay, certainly both in biblical and in Talmudic law, the king has a prescribed role within Jewish law, is able to do certain things and unable to do other things. Okay? And it's very clear that Maimonides is envisioning the Messiah as a king of Israel and not a particularly notable king of Israel. Okay? So he says, in the future, the Messianic king will arise and renew the Davidic dynasty, restoring it to its initial sovereignty. This is a very interesting idea. I think in our modern experience, we're so accustomed to thinking of time as a straight line. And Jewish time really isn't that way. Jewish time is sort of simultaneously a line and a circle. Okay, think about the Hanukkah blessings, right? Right, Bayamim hahem bazman hazeh. In those days, at this time, right? So it's far back in time on the line, but it's at this point in the circle which recurs every year. And therefore, the Messianic king is not something only in the future, but the future in some ways is a restoration of the past. Okay, so and I think this is a core idea of Jewish messianism, that the Messiah, it's something in the future, but that future will somehow reflect the past. I mean, we think about the next to last line of Eicha, of Lamentations, that we recite every time we put the Torah back away, right? Hashivenu, right? Adonai elecha v'nashuva, bring us back, O God, and we will return. Chadesh yameinu kakedem, renew our days like they were back then, which is a strange thing to say. If it's new, right, then it's not the way it was. But in this Jewish idea of renewal or newness is actually a resumption of the way it was in the past. And it's a really different way of thinking about time. Okay, he will build the temple, crucial issue, and gather the dispersed of Israel. Then in his days, the observances of all the statutes will return to their previous state. Okay, the Rambam is very aware that we are unable to perform all of the commandments bazman hazeh in this time, because the vast majority of the commandments are dependent upon the temple, or at least dependent upon a functioning temple system. We will offer sacrifices, observe the sabbatical and jubilee years according to all their particulars as described in the Torah. Okay, great. This is interesting. Anyone who does not believe in him or does not await his coming denies not only the statements of the other prophets, but those of the Torah and Moses, our teacher. The Rambam rarely uses the word ma'amin. For instance, at the very beginning of the Mishneh Torah, he doesn't say commandment number 1 is to believe in God. He says commandment number 1 is to know that there is a God, right? Which is really interesting. So the fact that he uses this sort of belief language is interesting. And he brings all of these verses, okay, including the one that we saw from Numbers, right? I see it, but not now. This refers to David. This was exactly the right. Darach kochav b'Yaakov, a star will come forth from Jacob. This is exactly that passage. You see him quoting it, right? I perceive it not in the near future. This refers to the Messianic king. A star shall come forth from Jacob. This refers to David. And a staff shall rise in Israel. This refers to the Messianic king. Okay, so he doesn't dispute that Rabbi Akiva was focused on the right verse. Of course it's the right verse. It's just it was the wrong Messiah. Okay. But this is a kind of uniquely rabbinic messianism. One should not presume that the Messianic king must work miracles and wonders, bring about new phenomena in the world, resurrect the dead, or perform similar deeds. This is definitely not true. Okay, the Messianic era for Maimonides will not have a radical change in the rules of nature. Okay? And here he quotes this. Proof can be brought from the fact that Rabbi Akiva, one of the greater sages of the Mishnah, was one of the supporters of King Bar Koziba and would describe him as the Messianic king. Okay? Here you can see how Maimonides is drawing and seeking to combine the Yerushalmi and the Bavli that we saw before, which were really very different. But of course, he wants to harmonize them into a single story. Just 1 second, Sheila, right? He and all the sages of the generation considered him to be the Messianic king until he was killed because of his sins. Once he was killed, they realized he was not the Messiah. The sages did not ask him for any signs or wonders. Yeah, Sheila, go ahead.
In other words, we're saying that all these great people are not necessarily very perceptive. They're what's the word? They're naive. They accept the Kochba as a Messiah.
Yes,
they don't
but
think it through, you know?
Yes, but I think what the Rambam is doing here is saying, we all know, we don't have any evidence that Bar Kokhba performed any miracles. He didn't raise the dead. He didn't change the laws of nature. He was a normal human king. And therefore, the fact that they thought he was the Messiah, despite being totally normal, shows that whenever the Messiah comes, he'll be totally normal. They thought it was going to be Bar Kokhba. And when they realized they were wrong, they said, oops, no big deal.
So that allows us all to be careless in who we select. And we can't.
I see why you're reading it that way. But yeah, the proof is in the pudding, right? I mean, again.
The proof is also for Jesus.
Well, indeed, he will build the temple and gather the dispersed of Israel. Now, the Rambam is going to hold your horses on Jesus. The Rambam is getting there. Okay. The main thrust of the matter is this Torah, its statutes and its laws are everlasting. We may not add to them or detract from them. And you're absolutely right. He's got Jesus on the brain, because the way that ultimately, regardless of what Matthew thinks Jesus is doing, certainly by the time that Paul's vision of a Gentile Christianity appears, among the major features of Gentile Christianity is the law, the laws of the Torah, halacha, right? The legal system of circumcision and kashrut and Shabbat and all of those things are not applicable for Gentile Christians. And for this, that more than anything else for the Rambam shows that Jesus could not have been the Messiah, because the Torah, its statutes, its laws are everlasting. We can't take any away from them. Okay? And that's crucial for Maimonides. Okay? And anyone who adds or detracts or reveals new aspects in the Torah, he's thinking explicitly about both Christianity and Islam, and brings the words of the commandments away from their simple meaning. This one is certainly an evildoer and a heretic. Okay, so the Messiah has to maintain Jewish practice, renew Jewish practice, not change Jewish practice. If a king will arise from the house of David who diligently contemplates the Torah and observes its mitzvot as prescribed in the written law and the oral law, as David, his ancestor, did, will compel all of Israel to walk in the way of the Torah, rectify the breaches in observance, and fight the wars of God, we may with assurance consider him the Messiah. Okay? We've got potential messiahs out there. If he succeeds in the above, builds the temple in its place and gathered the dispersed of Israel, then he's definitely the Messiah. So this is interesting, right? And I think, again, he may be playing on, well, how could the sages have proclaimed Bar Kokhba as the Messiah? Well, if Bar Kokhba was encouraging everybody to be observant, I don't know how the Rambam might know this. In fact, this is actually probably true about Bar Kokhba. One of the letters of Bar Kokhba is a letter to someone instructing him to rent wagons to bring lulavs and etrogs to his soldiers. Right in the middle of the war, it seems like Bar Kokhba was expending valuable resources to make sure that everybody had their own lulav. Okay, which is pretty interesting. Okay? So if he's definitely the Messiah, then he will improve the entire world, motivating all the nations to serve God together. If he did not succeed to this degree, or was killed, right, while he's the sort of potential Messiah, okay, he surely is not the Redeemer promised in the Torah. Rather, he should be considered as all the other proper and complete kings of the Davidic dynasty who died. Okay, it could have been, but it didn't work out that way. Okay? And here, and of course, this is a section that has been excised from the printed versions of Maimonides, as you'll see for obvious reasons in a second, right? But exists in the manuscript versions of the Code of Maimonides. Jesus of Nazareth, who aspired to be the Messiah and was executed by the court. Okay, here Maimonides is relying on a rather strange passage in Tractate Sanhedrin at page 41, in which Jesus is depicted not as killed by the Roman Empire, but by the Sanhedrin. Right? The Sanhedrin, Tractate Sanhedrin claims, and you can almost hear it as the response. Some of you probably, as I, have been accused of being a Christ killer in your lives. In Hebrew school, I never understood this as a kid. But I remember very clearly my teacher telling me, if anybody ever tells you you killed Jesus, this is what you're supposed to say. You're supposed to say, oh, no, it wasn't us. It was the Romans. Crucifixion is not a Jewish punishment. It's a Roman punishment. Therefore, don't blame us. That's what I was told to say. It never made any sense to me, and I didn't understand why. I think in retrospect, it's because it's sort of a category error. What is being claimed is a theological claim. You killed God. But to respond to a theological claim with a historical denial is sort of missing the point, right? You can almost imagine the Talmud giving a much more full-throated answer, which is to say, of course we killed him, and it was the right thing to do. Okay, now, this is obviously a text which would probably make many of my students deeply uncomfortable, and I'm not teaching it with glee, right? And clearly only the kind of rabbis who live in a non-Christian empire could probably get away with saying this. But you could understand what might motivate the rabbis to say such a thing. Okay. Right? All the prophets spoke of the Messiah as the Redeemer of Israel and their Savior who would gather their dispersed and strengthen their observance. In contrast, Christianity caused the Jews to be slain by the sword, the remnants to be scattered and humbled, the Torah to be altered, and the majority of the world to err and serve a God other than God. Okay? So you'd think that's a really, really, really anti-Christian statement from Maimonides. And yet, he now says something fantastic. And this is sort of what I was relying or alluding to before. Maybe this is how Rambam is reading that passage of the Messiah won't come until the whole world is converted to heresy. Okay? Nevertheless, right, the intent of the creator of the world is not within the power of man to comprehend. For his ways are not our ways, nor his thoughts our thoughts, right? He's almost quoting the passage from Isaiah 56, which we read on fast days, which is among the most beautiful passages of the entire Bible, maybe entire world literature. Right? Ultimately, all the deeds of Jesus of Nazareth and that Ishmaelite who arose after him, isn't it interesting how he's willing to conflate the Prophet Muhammad into this narrative, okay? That these both other monotheistic religions, right, come into this discourse of messianism, right? They only serve to prepare the way for Mashiach's coming and the improvement of the entire world, motivating the nations to serve God together. As Zephaniah states, I will transform the peoples to a purer language, that they will all come upon the name of God and serve him with one purpose. Okay, so he's anti-Christian. He thinks Jesus is a false Messiah. And yet, there's actually maybe part of the divine plan in both Christianity and Islam. Okay, how so? The entire world has already become filled with the mention of Mashiach, Torah, and mitzvot. Right? How so? Well, right, there are Jesuit missionaries in every country on the globe dispersing the Tanakh as we would have it. So for Maimonides, even though he's anti-Christianity, he thinks that this is sort of an improvement, right? At least there are Bibles in every motel room in America. These matters have been spread to the furthermost islands and to many stubborn-hearted nations. They discuss these matters and the mitzvot of the Torah, saying these mitzvot were true, but were already negated in the present age and are not applicable for all time, right? This is how Maimonides understands the core Christian claim, right? Others say, implied in these mitzvot are hidden concepts that cannot be understood simply. The Messiah has already come and revealed these hidden truths. Again, he is sort of channeling core Christian ideas. Now, exactly how Maimonides knows these ideas, does he know of Coptic Christians in Egypt, right? We don't really know. When the true messianic king will arise and prove successful, his position becoming exalted and uplifted, they will all return and realize that their ancestors endowed them with a false heritage and their prophets and ancestors caused them to err. It's interesting that he calls them prophets, right? Nowhere ever does he deny that Muhammad was a prophet. His only claim is that his claim with Islam is really that Muslims say that Muhammad was greater than Moses. He never denies that there are non-Jewish prophets to non-Jewish nations. He's not willing to deny that. Now, is that a political thing, right? Living in the world of Islam, is that something that he can't get away with not saying? Or is it something that he really believes? Again, it's hard to know. And finally, do not presume that in the Messianic age, any facet of the world's nature will change, or that there will be innovations in the work of creation. Okay, not only will the Messiah not be a wonder worker, a magician, a miracle, but the basic state of the world will stay the same. Right? Rather, the world will continue according to its pattern. Although Isaiah states the wolf will dwell with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the young goat, these words are metaphors and parables. The interpretation of the prophecy is as follows: Israel will dwell securely together with the wicked Gentiles who are likened to a wolf and a leopard, as in the prophecy of Jeremiah, etc. Okay. Our sages taught there will be no difference between the current age and the Messianic age, except the emancipation from our subjugation to the Gentile kingdoms. Okay, there'll be political sovereignty over the land of Israel. Okay, and if again, this is an idea that is not one that I embrace, but many religious Zionists in our day see the fact that there is Jewish sovereignty over the land of Israel again as this kind of harbinger of the Messianic age. I mean, think about it. The prayer that Agnon wrote for the chief rabbinate, what we refer to as the Tfilah L'Shlom HaMedina, the prayer for the well-being of Israel. Avinu Shebashamayim, Sur Yisrael v'Goalo, God in heaven, rock and redeemer of Israel. Barech et Medinat Yisrael, bless the state of Israel. Reshit Smichat Geulatenu, the beginning of the flowering of our redemption. Right? There is a theological claim there. I don't know how comfortable we all are with it, but it's right there that the fact that the state exists as sovereign over the land of Israel means that it is, now it's hedged, about as hedged as it could be, the beginning of the flowering of, right? It's the beginning of the beginning of the beginning of the beginning, barely into, but nonetheless, the Messianic age has begun because of sovereignty over the land of Israel. And finally, he says, all these and similar matters cannot be definitely known by man until they occur, for these matters are undefined in the prophet's words, and even in the wise men have no established tradition regarding these matters, except their own interpretation of the verses, right? He's basically taking those 12 pages of the Talmud and ripping them up before our eyes. Therefore, there's a controversy among them regarding these matters. Regardless of the debate concerning these questions, neither the order of the occurrence of these events or their precise detail are among the fundamental principles of the faith. That is to say, and I love to sort of quote this to my students, Judaism maybe says you got to believe in the Messiah, but beyond that, when the Messiah will come, how the Messiah will come, what the world will be like, we don't know, and you're allowed to think whatever you want. Person should not occupy himself with the Agadot and homiletics concerning these and similar matters, right? We saw this with Rabbi Zera above, that he would yell at anybody who was trying to calculate when the Messiah would come, right? Nor should he consider them as essentials, for the study of them will neither bring fear or love of God. Similarly, one should not try to determine the appointed time for the Messiah's coming. Our sages declared, may the spirits of those who attempted to determine the time of the Messiah's coming expire. Rather, one should await and believe in the general conception of the matter as explained. Right? So I think Maimonides here is really comes down on the side of hold your horses, and we don't really know. And that anybody who's too actively engaged in messianic speculation is somehow on the wrong track. He certainly sees both Islam and certainly Christianity as messianisms of a degree. I think the fact that he thinks that both the fact of Islam and Christianity in the world he sees as positive developments, I think is fascinating, is among the earliest sort of sources in Jewish history, which might point to a kind of interreligious engagement, right? If he thinks that ultimately Christianity and Islam are good for the world, I mean, that's very interesting. And I don't mean to overstate the claim, right? He's a medieval thinker caught in medieval ways of being in polemics against Christianity and Islam. And yet there's this sort of opening for, maybe these things are good developments. But, right, he is very, very deeply skeptical about how much we can know about messianism and how much we might be able to affect it. And so I think this is sort of ultimately the core rabbinic approach. Yes, Messiah, but no to particulars, and a kind of deep skepticism of messianism, and yet, right, clearly preserving voices which are much more excited, much more engaged in speculation and attempts to bring the messianic redemption. And so that tension, I think, really remains in force in rabbinic Judaism. And I think, as Sheila was really, pointing us to, I wonder how much of the rabbinic knowledge of Christian messianism and its consequences for Jews might have been one of these examples in which core Jewish ideas develop in conversation with Christianity and in conversation with Christian ideas, and part of the resistance both to viewing the Messianic age as radically new and different and miraculous and on the precipice of coming. I mean, those are two really core Christian ideas of messianism, that the second coming might be any day, and that the second coming will usher in a radically different experience of the world. Right? Rabbinic Judaism really responds to both of those claims and says absolutely not. And therefore, sort of you can't really understand our messianism without a kind of engagement with Christianity and with Christian ideas. Happy to take some questions before we leave it at that, if people have them. While you're thinking of questions, if you have them, I just want to tell you about the lecture. Oh, Barry, go ahead.
Go ahead. It sounded like you were going to make an announcement. Please go ahead.
I was, but go ahead. Your question is more important.
Okay, thank you. I've been in and out on this more than I anticipated, but every minute was of great value to me. So thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you for your kind
I might have missed this, and maybe not, about how blood is viewed, both within Jewish ritual and Christian ritual. I had a student, I've taught some of these courses, not at the level that you are, but I have taught some of this in the Kansas City area. And something that was brought to mind was a parallel, and it's been in my head since, and you remind me of it, the significance of blood. And it said somewhere in the New Testament, a Jewish person purportedly is quoted as saying, "Let Jesus's blood be upon us." And we know how problematic that has been. But to equate that then with the installation of Aaron's sons into priesthood, and that blood was placed upon them at that time. It's a world of difference, but could there be some similarity there, some parallel there?
So I would say two things. First of all, you're quoting, I mean, it's really in Matthew, where the crowd and only in Matthew, where the crowd chants that, which is fascinating, right? The sort of generational guilt and the blood guilt, and there's clearly a long history of that. It's true, of course, that the priests are anointed with oil and they sprinkle a lot of the blood. The blood isn't put on them so much. I mean, accidentally, presumably, but they sprinkled the blood on the altar when they do the sacrifices. There is this very famous passage in Paul's letter to the Hebrews where the blood comes up, and where Paul seems to be, I forget exactly where in Hebrews it is, but Paul is arguing for the superiority of Jesus over the high priest, right? And says that when the high priest goes in on Yom Kippur with the blood, that Aaron is using blood that's not his own blood. And that when Jesus comes in and it's interesting to think of the way that Paul may be thinking of Jesus as high priest. Paul, of course, is still writing at a time when the temple is still standing, right? Paul's argument is Jesus is better because Jesus is using Jesus's own blood. And this notion of Jesus as the sacrifice, right? This is something that's strange for us and maybe off-putting for us. But yeah, I mean, I think the atoning power of blood is something that is core to Leviticus, and I mean, I think it makes a great deal of sense from one kind of perspective that in sacrifice we're sort of saying it ought to be our blood being spilled out because we've really screwed up, right? But we're sort of we have this replacement animal that we use, and I think that language of sacrifice. And it's theologically very difficult because, right, Jesus is sort of simultaneously the high priest and the Paschal Lamb at the same time, which is hard to be both, right? And yet those metaphors are clearly used in that way, and I think this is another great example of why you can't understand Hebrews or Paul without understanding Second Temple Judaism. right? Paul's writing in a world in which his entire audience, Jew and Gentile alike, would be familiar with animal sacrifice and the blood and the sprinkling of blood as a way to achieve kapara, atonement. And so that symbolic use of blood is of course parallel, because it's coming out of a sacrificial system in which that's the way that you get kapara, is by the sprinkling of blood. So absolutely. Yeah, Sheila.
Do you think then, at the time of, originally there was a sprinkling of blood, and then it sort of advanced to the sprinkling of people, in other words, killing people, not, in other words, it's not just the blood, but it's the whole thing, the whole person that
I
gets,
mean,
I'm thinking of the Crusades.
yeah, so I mean, I think this is
Rambam.
it's really interesting to go there. I mean, if you look at midrashim composed around the time of the Crusades, when, you know, as we all know, Jews were slaughtered, and Jewish parents saw their children slaughtered, right? You have all of these kind of midrashim about the Akedah, about how Abraham actually had to go through with it and actually did sacrifice Isaac, and that Isaac was then, you know, resurrected, or, you know, all kinds of notions like that. But I think that the experience of death and destruction as a kind of atoning process is part of Jewish history. It's something that makes me feel very uncomfortable theologically. I have even heard, right, in Israel, Haredi rabbis say that the Holocaust was purification of European Jewry for having embraced the Enlightenment, right? And again, the look on Sheila's face, I don't know if you can see it as well as I can. That's how I feel about it too. I agree. And yet, that's also a part of the tradition, as horrible as it may sound. And I think it goes back deeply to exactly the kinds of things that you're saying. I can't say it enough. I think that's wrong. I think that's bad. But there are people out there who think it, and it's connected to these things that we're talking about.
What about and we always get back the example. What about the rabbis that were killed?
Yeah,
the Gedolim who were killed.
That's right. So if you think
And
about
that
the Eila Ezkara, right? If you're bored on Yom Kippur, I don't know why anybody would ever be bored late in the afternoon on Yom Kippur, right? But you could spend some, or even earlier in the day, right? If you look at that poem and the theology of that poem, it's a very late poem. And very much, it's historically totally inaccurate. Whoever writes that poem doesn't seem to know the first thing about Talmudic chronology, but that's not the point, right? And I think is very much somebody in a medieval mindset who has experienced pogroms and experienced all kinds of violence, and is trying to make theological sense of it using the sacrificial model. And that's a part of the tradition too. It's a shame. I mean, nobody's left in shul that part of the day, but it's really interesting. It's not as big a shame as the way Yonah. I mean, Sefer Yonah is among the most fascinating books of the Bible, right? And we read it at the least well-attended time of Yom Kippur. I mean, in most places. I just want to invite everyone. I'll be giving a lecture on Monday evening at 7:00 here at John Carroll, which is really mostly about my new book, which has recently been published. And I'll be talking about the Talmudic academies and ways in which the Talmudic academies and Christian scholastic centers in the same time and the same place, that is Babylonia during the Persian period, how they reflect one another, and that some of these borrowing, these sort of theological borrowings that I'm sort of hinting at in a class like this, are also paralleled by kind of institutional parallels. And I hope to sort of make a little bit of a broader statement about how the Talmudic period, especially in Babylonia, in which Zoroastrian Persians are running the show, very tolerant of religious minorities. There are Buddhists and Jews and Christians and all kinds of people who are competing in the marketplace of ideas in late antique Babylonia. And maybe not surprisingly, Jews and Christians sort of order their religious lives in similar ways. I mean, if you think about how Federation of Cleveland organizes itself, and how Catholic Charities of Cleveland organizes itself, it's pretty similar, right? Here we are in America, two sort of minority religions who are kind of different from the mainstream boarding Protestants, but also kind of the same or recognizable to them. And we organize our religious lives in our communities in ways that are really parallel. Well, that's not new. And Jews and Christians have been doing that and borrowing from one another and engaging with one another in this way for a very long time.
But you're only going to be in person.
I am only going to be in person. This is true.
I'm not ready to go out.
It'll be recorded. You can watch the video afterwards if you don't want to come.
Rabbi, this is
Yes.
Cheryl Bellamy.
Harold, please go ahead.
I wanted to refer to the quote of Zapania, I think is his name, who I think it was McMonaghy was quoting him about a pure language. And yet
Yes.
I like what McMonaghy says. The earth is going to be the same. It's not going to be a new heaven. It's not going to be a new earth, but it's going to be the same.
Right.
But the pure language, what is that? Is it the language of God?
I think the way
Hebrew?
Maimonides is thinking about it is he's using language, not in terms of language, but is in terms of theological discourse or something like that.
Okay.
And I think what he really means is monotheism, right? That among the great benefits for Jews in a world in which, it's less true for us. Maimonides didn't know about the Far East, right? Didn't know Indians and Chinese people, and right? But for all of Maimonides' world, that is the world of Christianity and the world of Islam, he recognizes that his whole world is a monotheistic world, right? Which is so radically different from the polytheistic pagan world that the rabbis of the Talmud had to encounter. And he thinks that's an improvement, right? And I think it's improvement as well, right? I mean, I don't know how much you experience this, but like I spend my days with Catholic folks who are deeply moral people, right? Who care deeply about the world and other people because they believe that God commands them to do so, right? To take care of the homeless, to feed the naked, to make peace on earth. They really, really, really believe this. And it's hard for me as a religious person not to be inspired by that and to really think, okay, we're kind of on the same team here, right? We believe in the same God. Yeah, we have theological disagreements. We think they're wrong about stuff and they think we're wrong about stuff. But in general, the notion that we think that God commands us to create moral communities and societies, that's good. Right? That's good. And that therefore the whole world is speaking this language of an ethical monotheism. I think Maimonides is sort of pointing to that kind of experience that I think a lot of us have. I don't know about you, but if you ever do service projects with religious Christians, right? There's some real, they do it because they think that God really wants them to help perfect the world, and I think we share that. In a deep way. And I think that's what he's getting at.
Okay, now another question I do have, and I heard this, I don't know if it's true or not, that McMonaghy felt that Islam was much more monotheism as opposed to Christianity, which worship idols. He did not, he was very uncomfortable with that.
So let me be clear. I would not feel comfortable calling contemporary Christians idolaters.
Right.
It's true. He does. Of course, he doesn't live among Christians. So how much he actually knows about Christians is a good question.
Yeah.
It's true that many Christians are more comfortable with images than we are. Right.
Right.
But if you ask Christians, why are you worshiping a statue? Right? They will say, I'm not worshiping that statue. That statue helps. That I don't believe that is Jesus. Right? That helps me think about Jesus or something like that. And again, this is not the way we do it. But I certainly am not comfortable calling Christians idolaters, but I would probably be comfortable saying that Muslims have a much purer monotheism than many Christians do, right? There's very complicated and theologically sophisticated notions of the persons of the Trinity in ways that God is three, but really one, right? Muslims don't have that complexity. One God, one God, one God. I would just say we have our own issues in this, right? When we talk about the Shekhinah, and especially in Kabbalah and the Sfirot and different emanations and different aspects and different, Kabbalah is not really my shtick, but it's not so crazy different from Trinitarian ideas. And I think we should be careful before we sort of smear Christians and Christianity for
Well,
being...
I don't think I'm sneering it. I'm just
No, I'm not I'm sorry if I'm if
No,
I came off as accusing you of that. I'm just saying that I don't think we should think that. I'm not insinuating that you were saying that.
I'm just trying to think about what going to the grades today, a lot of Jews will pray. And it's the same thing that McMonamy speaks about, the idolatry, or some of the Christians who pray to statues, and it reminds them of the Virgin Mary or somebody else. But
you're right. So another famous voice, and then I want to take Barry's question, but another famous medieval voice is that of Rabbeinu Tam, who is Rashi's grandson, who has this wonderful line, right? He is asked, well, are Jews allowed to go into business partnerships with Christians? Because as part of doing business partnerships, they're going to swear in the name of a saint or in the name of Mary or in the name of Jesus that they're an honest person and they're going to keep their end of the deal. So if I'm going into business with a non-Jew and thereby making them swear in the name of a false god, maybe I'm not allowed to have business partnerships. And Rabbeinu Tam says as follows, no. They, right, mitkaven leborei shamayim va'aretz, that when they swear to a saint, they say Jesus, but they mean God. And therefore we can go by what they mean, not by what they say. Now, I don't know if that is a technical loophole to sort of get around an economic issue to enable Jews to make livelihood, but theologically it's very clever, right? Which is to say, well, I don't quite understand theologically what they're saying, but they're really monotheists. They have a way of complicating this in ways that we disagree with, but they're monotheists, and therefore when they swear or do religious rituals and there are images involved, we should not put them in the idolatry box. Barry, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. With regard to ecumenical work in today's world,
yes,
and it's a personal question. So, have you been to a Good Friday service? Would you attend a Good Friday service? And in terms of looking at the rhetoric, sometimes the remarks that are made, sometimes formal statements that go back and forth, how would you advise a Jewish organization, in terms of giving some feedback on? I know there's a great deal of commonality with what happens in one Catholic worship setting and another, but just in terms of how would you guide, maybe personally been involved, responses? And the example I'll take is Good Friday.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I think the Catholic Church, and you can trace the liturgy from the 60s to the day, the Catholic Church has taken this very, very, very seriously. Has taken that line about the perfidy of the Jews out, no longer prays for the Jews at all, had really, really, really radically changed the liturgy around Good Friday in ways that I can only describe as tshuva. Right, my senior colleague Ed Hannenberg, who's a scholar of Vatican II, and I have talked about this at great length and knows a lot more about it. whether I would or wouldn't go to mass, right? That's a good question. I don't know how I feel. I feel very uncomfortable. I don't know if that's my own issues or not, but I think that the Catholic Church has really taken seriously the claim that the theological elements that were once evidenced in those sermons and in that liturgy were responsible directly or indirectly for the Shoah. They really take that seriously, and have made a change to the liturgy on that basis. And I don't think they get enough credit for it from the Jewish community. It takes a lot for a longstanding religious tradition to say we were wrong and we have to change this. And I think I think that's really impressive. Now, do I think that there's a lot of sort of soft supersessionism in the liturgy? Of course there is, and lots of things that would make us feel very uncomfortable. Every year at the beginning of every school year, the Jesuit tradition is to have a Mass of the Spirit at the beginning of every academic year, and they're so clever, right? Because they can't actually invite practitioners of other religions to come and participate in the service, because that would sort of be breaking the rules. But what they do is they ask people to read prayers in a variety of different languages. And the two people who they invite to read prayers in different languages are the professor of Islamic studies to read a prayer in Arabic, and the professor of Jewish studies to read a prayer in biblical Hebrew, right? So, I put on my tallis to sort of show everybody that I'm a rabbi and I'm not there to say mass, and I won't march behind the cross. I won't process in. I'll be there, and I don't bow, and I don't bow my head, and I don't obviously say the prayers or things like that, but I sort of signal that I am a guest and an outsider, and I say my prayer in biblical Hebrew, which I always have great fun writing, and that's the way that I feel comfortable, really, because I really feel that the Catholic Church is like reaching out their hand in friendship to Jews and Judaism, taking deeply seriously the ways in which their own theology has caused, murder in the past, and saying that they don't believe that anymore. And I think that's really worth engaging with. If you're interested in another class sometime, we could think about Vatican II and Jewish responses to Vatican II. There are two incredible primary texts. Both Rabbi Soloveitchik in YU and Heschel at JTS essentially write explicit responses to Vatican II, right? Which could be summed up as follows. Soloveitchik says, "No, thank you." And Heschel says, "Yes, please," right? Heschel writes this speech called "No Religion is an Island," which he delivers at Union Theological Seminary, which he sort of decries the secularism and godlessness of the 60s and says, "Thank you very much, Catholic Church. We're on the same page. We're brothers in bringing peace and justice to the world. Let's work together." And Soloveitchik says, "I don't trust you. We've heard this stuff before. And we simply," as he calls himself, the religion, the community of the few, and Catholics, the community of the many, and says that the power dynamic is so imbalanced that I just don't trust you. If we're willing to work with you on non-theological matters, right? If it's increasing, religious freedom or whatever, civil rights, okay, we'll work together. And we're willing to talk to you, but we demand complete autonomy. Don't tell us that you come from us. Don't tell us that we are theologically related. Don't tell us that you draw spiritual, sustenance from the Jewish people. No, no, no. We will talk to you as long as you treat us as autonomous and unique. And those are pretty different visions. And it's sort of interesting, 60 years in, sort of have those positions changed? What is the current ways in which contemporary Orthodox Jews do and don't continue Soloveitchik's mandate. In some ways, Orthodox Jews in America and Catholics in America find themselves on the same side of a lot of political issues, whether it's abortion or school vouchers or all these kinds of things, in ways that liberal Jews tend not to want to work on this. So it's complicated. But these are really interesting topics, and I think that not enough Jews really know about this. And look, I mean, this is part of why I'm here, right? John Carroll University desperately wants to know who these people are walking around in business suits at 9 o'clock on Saturday mornings, right? Who are they? They live in a Jewish neighborhood. Who are these people? What makes them tick? Why don't they want to talk to us? Right?
Very quickly, I was a student of Rabbi Drinan, father and congressman, and he was the side of Jesus. And he told me that when he campaigned back in Massachusetts for election and re-election, he'd be asked what the SJ was, and you probably have heard this. He says the SJ stands for somewhat Jewish.
Somewhat Jewish, right. Well, Rabbi, yes, go ahead.
I was going to sort of put on a community
relations hat for a moment, because what you're talking about reminds me of what we always said we were trying to do. But I guess I would say that it's always complicated, isn't it? Because for everybody who wants to engage in community relations, I'll use the phrase on both sides, there might be somebody on both sides who, for whatever reason, and some of them might be not hateful and others might be hateful, don't want to engage in community relations or have much of a relationship at all, or want a relationship only on whatever their own terms might or might not be. So it doesn't mean we don't do it, and it doesn't mean we don't engage, but we, at the same time, it seems to me, have to be mindful that there are sometimes forces that are working against that at the same time.
I totally agree. I totally agree. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly much easier in an academic classroom, right? I have it easy. I don't have a lot of heavy lifting to do, right? Because I can always sort of punt and say, oh, I'm just talking about text. I'm just talking about history, right? It's all intellectual, right? It's much harder to actually to organize dialogue or to identify the kinds of things that the projects that people could really work on. On the other hand, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think we live in a broken world and we need all the allies we can get. And there certainly are people in the Catholic world who really feel the same way. And the Jesuit thing is also true. I mean, we could also think about the history of the Jesuits. The Jesuits are founded very shortly after the expulsion from Spain.
Right.
In that context. And a great many of the early Jesuits were themselves new Christians. And so these Jesuit insistence on scholasticism and text and casuistics and answering questions with questions and sort of all of that shtick, right? It is not
familiar,
accidental that I think so many of the early Jesuits were themselves Jews. Maybe not Jews in the religious sense, but certainly Jews in the cultural and ethnic sense. And I think that has had a profound effect on the history of the Jesuits. The Jesuits were essentially the only Catholics who insisted that the Talmud never be burned, that you don't burn books, right? Who knows what's in there? We haven't read them. And we won't be able to read them if you burn them all, so don't burn them. Right? And so, yeah.
Aren't the Jesuits a little more scholarly than the rest of them?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
They're the ones who found
yes.
in the university.
Right. And so I don't want to overstate it, but you get what I'm sort of hinting at, that there are these connections there. And I think they continue. The amount of my Jesuit colleague, Jim Bretsky, in my department has come over to Shabbos dinner, right? And I gave a Devar Torah and handed him the Vulgate. right? And I read from the Hebrew and he read from the Latin, and we argued about the text and, matzo ball soup. And it wasn't the first Shabbos meal that he'd ever come to, right? Like he knew what to do. So,
He
I
likes
think that's,
Jewish food.
yeah, that's normal. And I think that, and I'm not sure that, I shouldn't speak for anybody but myself, but I didn't really know anything about that until I showed up here. And sort of assumed that I would be encountering a sort of Good Friday sermon from the ancient past, and have been so pleasantly surprised that that's the opposite. The first thing that the chair of my department did when getting me in office was to remove the crucifix from it.
Wow.
Right? Now, this is a devout Catholic for whom, right? That's real. Right?
But you had
taking it down because she knew that I wouldn't want it there, right? And didn't want to put me in a position of, well, do I take it? But she removed it herself, right? I mean, I think that's really thoughtful and caring and deeply, right, understanding in ways that I think they should get a lot of credit for.
And
But
did you
Hebrew
put up a
Academy-
mezuzah in its place?
I didn't put up a mezuzah because I never sleep here. But so it's not chayav in mezuzah, but I've been thinking about it. I probably should. Maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I won't say a bracha when I affix it, because you can put a mezuzah wherever you want, even in places you don't have to have a mezuzah. So I was thinking about putting a mezuzah as a sort of symbolic marker. And given that there's a hook on the wall where the crucifix is to go, maybe I should put a picture of the Rabbi or something.
Well, you also have to understand that Hebrew Academy used to send the kids to Notre Dame. Why? Because there they knew they had crucifixes in the room, but at least they knew that wasn't their religion.
Right.
And they gave them credit for all the work that they did at Yavne. So that with all, and John Carroll, also, a lot of them on this side of town,
right,
are also very nice to the Jews, because first of all, they live among us, they're more liberal, and they want the Jewish students.
Yeah.
I mean, you have a Hillel. You didn't have a Hillel at John Carroll when we came in 1970.
You're right, but we do now.
And
Rabbi-
having your chair means that more Jews will come. Jews pay tuition.
Yes.
And are
Yes,
very
please.
academic generally.
Yes,
So,
please.
I'm
Everything you're
sorry
saying.
to say it, but
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's part right now. Exactly how much people are, Jewish studies will bring in Jewish students. I don't know how many Jewish students really want to come and study Gemara in college, but
but they feel more comfortable knowing that, in other words, their parents don't mind sending them there because, hey, there's a school, and that means that there's some Jews.
If there's somebody with a beard and a yarmulke on campus, then that's right. Now, sometimes when I see the tour groups walking around, this prospective students walking around, and they see me, they think,
where are you?
But could also
but the ponytail helps because it makes you more modern.
Yeah, well, that's the goal.
I have one more question, Rabbi.
Go ahead, Cheryl,
okay,
and maybe with this we'll close.
Okay. I have a lot of respect for Rabbi Soloveitchik, but some of the things that was said, I didn't agree with. Like Herschel really participated with Martin Luther King, and I realized that in this synagogue, it was I could see there are a lot of people who didn't want to, a lot of the modern Orthodox, but I thought, that did not resonate.
I think it's complicated. I think Soloveitchik's stance in the civil rights movement is complicated. Certainly many of his students were very much in favor of participating and marching alongside King and things like that. I think Soloveitchik's concern, and I don't mean to defend him too much, is that, remember, here you have a European Jew after the Holocaust who was so deeply concerned for his own students and his own community, and was really, really worried about violent blowback on the Jewish community. Now, I don't know if that's a sufficient reason not to have participated. With the hindsight of history, I think we can now say that that was the wrong decision. But I don't think that his lack of full-throated support for the movement came from a place of racism. I think it came from a place of deep concern for the safety for Jewish bodies, and I think that's a reasonable thing to be worried about. Listen, I mean, I grew up in a house where my parents were always told me stories of coming to the March on Washington, and that was a deep part of their identity. And yet, I think Soloveitchik's deep concern for Jewish bodies is
sure. And that's a conflict with me because I am a Jew of color. So it's, it was very conflicting for me, and because I really like Soloveitchik and some of his, books that I've read. But when I heard that, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, because I never heard that part.
Well, Maimonides is also famously tells men that they're allowed to hit their wives. So lots of people who are great thinkers also said and thought terrible things. And I don't think there's any reason, this is part of why studying Jewish texts is so important, that we can hear multitude of voices, and that we are allowed to determine what we think is true and good from any source, and we should accept that which we think is true and good and reject that which we think is bad. And I think it goes the same for any book and any scholar. And that's part of what it is to study texts from the past. So thank you very much.